If there's one film director out there who's very much hot shit right now and didn't also make Parasite, it's Sam Mendes, the director of the multiple Oscar-winning, critically acclaimed, and seemingly shot in one continuous take First World War film 1917, which coincidentally is also the amount of edits Michael Bay would have made per second if he had directed the film. In what is a desperate attempt to distract myself from the fact that I auditioned to be an extra in 1917, got the part last minute, and then slept in and missed the shoot. Today we're asking, just how did one of Mendes' earlier films, the 2002 Great Depression-era gangster film Road to Perdition, pave the way for 1917, a film which critics are describing as both heart-stopping and heartbreaking, two terms which I've only ever used to describe that scene in Shrek 2 where a giant gingerbread man called Mongo slowly drowns in a moat. Well, get ready for a masterclass from Sam Mendes on how to evoke an emotional response, and some pretty big spoilers for 1917, because I'm Oscar from Screen on Point, and this is how Road to Perdition paved the way for 1917. When you think of the actor Tom Hanks, you probably think of his wholesome roles in Forrest Gump, Castaway, or Sully. What you probably don't think of straight away is a ruthless mafia enforcer mowing people down with a Tommy gun, which is what makes his role in Road to Perdition such a fascinating piece of casting against type, comparable to the masterful casting of Adam Sandler in Punch Drunk Love. Mendes arguably uses the audience's preconceived ideas about Hank's likeable good guy persona to increase their emotional response to what the character is forced to do. When Hank's character Michael Sullivan shoots various people, we don't often see Sullivan's entire body clearly framed as he pulls the trigger. One example of this being the scene in the nightclub. Mendes quickly cuts to a point of view shot as he shoots one guy, then an over-the-shoulder shot as he takes out the bodyguard. By withholding information from the audience, Mendes frequently subverts the expectations of the gangster genre, not glamorizing the violence or even giving the audience the satisfying payoff of dwelling on the central character pulling the trigger. The brief chat Sullivan has with the bodyguard humanizes what in other films would have been just a vehicle for bullets. For example, the countless faceless goons taken out in any number of Steven Seagal films by Steven Seagal, who ironically is himself also a faceless goon. By hinting at there being layers to the character of the bodyguard, it arguably makes just how quickly and casually he is killed that bit sadder. Unlike directors like Guy Ritchie or Quentin Tarantino that seem to linger on the spectacle of the violence, Mendes presents it almost as an afterthought, a pointless and senseless result of the choices his characters have been forced to make. By constantly showing the audience the ever-lovable Tom Hanks' face as he pulls the trigger off screen, or positioning them as Sullivan with point of view and over-the-shoulder shots, the audience are forced to come to terms with the tragic lengths that even an ordinary and relatable everyman like Hanks could be forced to go to in order to protect their family. The one time we do get an act of violence shown clearly on screen, it's from the perspective of Sullivan's son, and the brutal nature of the execution along with the eerie soundtrack positions the audience as Michael Jr., seeing the violence as something equally disturbing and traumatic. Mendes also plays with the audience's expectations of the bad guys in 1917. In a similar way to the portrayal of the German soldiers in Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, Mendes chooses to build up the tension by only showing glimpses of the German soldiers. This technique to build up anticipation of the film's antagonists by barely showing them can also be seen in Spielberg's Jaws, where the horror in the film is arguably ramped up by the fact that the audience barely see the film's monster, partly due to the fact that if it was shown clearly on screen, the animatronic shark would have looked less terrifying than Adam Sandler and Jack and Jill. Then again, that could apply to any movie monster that's ever existed. This approach follows in the conventions of classic war films which align the audience with one side of the conflict, whilst presenting the other side as an unknown threat. This dehumanising of the enemy is cleverly subverted by Mendes in a scene later on in the film, where Lance Corporal William Schofield comes across the German soldiers in the French town that I'm not even going to try to attempt to pronounce, as famously my French teacher laughed out loud during my Year 10 oral exam. When Schofield first sees the German soldier across the square, there is a moment where neither the audience or either of the characters know if the other is an enemy. In a similar way to the Nazi general's speech in Band of Brothers, where he describes the camaraderie and brothership the Nazi soldiers had for each other, this moment reminds the audience that only the uniform and the place of birth separates the soldiers from each side, which, like Road to Perdition, blurs that line between good and evil. If we look at the infamous shootout in the rain scene, we can see how Mendes uses every trick in the book to heighten the emotion and sadness of the scene. In fact, I'm tearing up just thinking about it. The somber tone is set from the opening shot, which is a crane shot slowly tracking up a lamppost. By framing the mobsters as being dwarfed by their surroundings, Mendes pulls a similar trick to that used by Hitchcock in high-angle shots of the detective in Psycho, using the camera work to reframe characters once in a position of authority as now vulnerable. The ethereal soundtrack, along with the movement of the camera into the sky, connotes Christian symbolism of a soul leaving the body and ascending into the heavens, and forebodes Rooney's death. By signposting Rooney's death early on in the scene, Mendes again presents the violence as an unavoidable inevitability, one which neither Michael or the audience will take any pleasure in. In a similar way to the pathetic fallacy of the rain in Road to Perdition, Mendes uses the mise-en-scène in 1917 to externally show the internal turmoil of the characters. When nighttime comes, the town is lit up by nearby explosions, and the film film's cinematographer Roger Deakins chooses to give the entire scene a nightmarish yellow hue. In a similar way to the cinematography in the World War II film Fury, connoting the terrible situation of the characters, this scene's colour palette is reminiscent of hellfire. As American Civil War General William Sherman famously said, "War is hell," and as singer Edwin Starr famously said, "War, huh? Good God. What is it good for? Absolutely nothing." From the violins of John Williams' iconic score for Schindler's List, to Willem Dafoe dropping to his knees in Platoon as Adagio for strings plays in the background, there is nothing quite like a film's soundtrack to create an emotional response in the audience. Unlike John Carpenter, who famously described his soundtracks as like wallpaper, in the background but not informing the mood of a scene, Mendes uses the minimal piano score in this scene to give what could have been an exciting shootout a sense of stillness, and introduces the idea that there is beauty within bleakness, an idea which is also present in Michael Bay's Pearl Harbor, as the experience of watching the film is overwhelmingly bleak, but it is a moment of beauty when the credits roll and you realise it's finally over. Mendes' scene opens with the score and the sound of the rain, which stops at the exact moment Rooney realises he's going to die. The slow motion movement of his goons as they all drop dead around him, contrasted with Rooney's stillness and quiet dignity, gives the scene a kind of ethereal beauty. This, accompanied by the score and with no diegetic sound, creates a feeling of calm, which is juxtaposed with the violence of the shootout. Mendes also uses the soundtrack of 1917 to highlight moments of beauty amongst all the violence. In the scene where William Schofield comes across a battalion of soldiers all sat around in a forest, the breathless pace of the film, which is arguably achieved by Mendes and Roger Deakins' decision that the film resemble one unbroken take, comes to a halt as a soldier stands up and begins to sing. Although the trope of a beautiful song being sung in the calm before a storm has been seen countless times before, from Pippin in Lord of the Rings, Podrick in Game of Thrones, or whatever song Michael Bay presumably sings to himself in his trailer on the set of yet another Transformers film whilst masturbating to his own reflection, Mendes' use of the song Poor Wayfaring Stranger still hits hard emotionally. The song is an old folk song thought to originate from the 19th century, which lyrics tell the story of a journey home. Having been described as an intense theme park ride, in this scene, Deakins' camera work slows the film's pace down dramatically to a crawl, tracking through the crowd of soldiers with an almost dreamlike quality. The young faces of all these soldiers, combined with the song's lyrics, act as a stark reminder that a lot of these men will never actually complete their journey home. Up until this point, the film is charged along at a breakneck pace, so when it suddenly slows down, both the audience and William are given a moment to take a breath and reflect on both the horrors he has experienced and the fate of all these unsuspecting soldiers if he can't stop them from going over the top. To use the ending of the film The Mist as an example, the bullets Thomas Jane uses to kill his son are seen fired from the outside of the car. So often it's what we don't see that can make a scene so effective, as the audience are forced to fill in the gaps with their own imagination. This can be further illustrated by the close-up shot of Sullivan as he pulls the trigger. We see the flash of the muzzle, and we hear the thud of Rooney's body hitting the ground, but we don't actually see the violence. Instead, Mendes chooses to hold on Sullivan's face. Although the audience don't have to see what Sullivan has done, the camera work reminds us that Sullivan isn't as lucky, and shooting his father figure is something he'll have to live with, admittedly for not much longer. To compare to how the scene might have been directed by a different director, and also have a cheap dig at Guy Ritchie in the process, if this had been shot by the Snatch and Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels director, not only would Sullivan likely be played by Jason Statham, but it probably would have played out a bit like this.
Next time I'll deflate all your balls, friend.
Mendes handles the violence of 1917 with a similar restraint, often choosing to focus on the after effect of violence as opposed to the act itself. This can be seen when the two central characters walk through no man's land. The brutal reality of war is represented by the rotting corpses of the soldiers' horses. Without having to explicitly show what happened on screen, Mendes' use of the dead horses reminds the audience that trench warfare wasn't all heroic and noble sacrifices, and also encourages them to imagine the horrors of war. In Christian theology, the term perdition refers to a state of eternal punishment or damnation that a sinner is believed to pass over into after death. This theme crops up throughout Road to Perdition. In one scene, Rooney tells Sullivan that,
"And there is only one guarantee. None of us will see heaven."
You can't help but think, if only the singer Belinda Carlisle had been around in this fictional depiction of the Great Depression, Sullivan might have at least taken some comfort in the knowledge that, when you think about it, heaven is actually a place on earth. Rooney's warning to Sullivan is a key piece of dialogue in summarising the themes of the film, as it suggests that the characters are trapped on this road to perdition or hell because of the choices they have made. This use of Christian imagery can also be seen in 1917, when Lieutenant Leslie splashes booze on the main characters as if it is holy water and says, "Through this holy unction may the Lord pardon you your faults, and whatever sins thou hast committed." The idea of an unattainable heaven can also be seen in the final scenes of Road to Perdition, where Sullivan is ambushed by Harlan Maguire. The slow pan across the sea and over to the beach, where the father and son walk side by side, along with the rousing score, sets the tone of the scene, which can be read as a kind of false ending, teasing Sullivan with the happiness that he has been searching for throughout the film's narrative. The beach hut which Sullivan walks into is decorated in a heavenly white, symbolising purity and innocence. As Sullivan looks out of the window at the sea and sees his son playing in the sand, the character seems finally at peace. And that's a sentence which I'm only just realising now probably had too much alliteration in it. The glass that separates Sullivan from his son reflects the idyllic landscape of the beach, and acts as a physical barrier that tragically implies that this ideal is unattainable for the character. At the risk of sounding like some kind of deranged superfan obsessed with talking about Adam Sandler, if you imagine for a moment, and bear with me on this one, the character of Sullivan is Adam Sandler, and the glass is Adam Sandler's body of terrible comedy work with Kevin James and Rob Schneider. I'm fully aware that I've kind of lost my way with this analogy a bit, but what I'm trying to say is it's films like Grown Ups or Click that arguably acted as that barrier, preventing Adam Sandler from getting the Oscar he should have got for Uncut Gems. But back to that scene in Road to Perdition, and with the promise that I won't mention Adam Sandler again, it's the juxtaposition between this moment of calm, accompanied by the sound of the sea, and the nightmare we've seen Sullivan have up until this point, that lulls the audience into a false sense of security, tricking them into believing that maybe Rooney was wrong, maybe redemption is possible for a character like Sullivan. The fact that the scene is blocked so that Sullivan is shot in the back as he watches his son through the window gives it an element of cruelty, as both Sullivan and the audience are given a taster of the normal life Sullivan will never be able to have. It's as if, just after Adam Sandler found out he was snubbed by the Academy, Rob Schneider had not only won Best Leading Actor and Best International Film somehow, but had also popped up behind him and said, "You can do it!" The shocking violence, contrasted with the imagery of the sea's reflection, and the fact that Mendes chooses to hold on that shot for a while, forces the audience to be directly confronted with the repercussions of Sullivan's violent lifestyle. When General Enamor says, "Down to Gehenna or up to the throne, he travels the fastest who travels alone," it suggests that, like Sullivan in Road to Perdition, the central characters in 1917 are unavoidably on the road to Gehenna, or hell. There are clear comparisons between the two sets of fathers and sons we see in Road to Perdition. As Rooney says, natural law, sons are put on earth to trouble their fathers. Michael Jr. witnessing the crime at the beginning sets the events of the film in motion, and equally the actions of Rooney's son lead to Sullivan having to take revenge. Note that unlike the character of Rooney, Mendes never blames the sons for what transpires, instead we can interpret them as being a product of their fathers. When Connor Rooney is executed in the bath, Mendes shoots the scene so we see the after effects of the violence in a mirror reflection. This withholds from the audience the moment of satisfying revenge the film seemed to have been leading up to, arguably asking the audience to question why they wanted to see the cycle of violence continue. Interestingly, the next shot of Michael Jr. is framed through a door frame which looks a lot like a mirror. By visually drawing comparisons between the two sons, Mendes seems to be suggesting that Connor's fate is inevitable for Michael Jr. if, like Connor, he chooses to follow in his father's footsteps. Throughout the film, Mendes implies that this will happen. When we first see Michael Jr., he's riding a bicycle and behaving like a child. After the murder of his family, we get a motivated close-up of the same bicycle, now abandoned in the snow. This can be interpreted as suggesting that Michael Jr.'s childhood is now over, and this idea that he's forced into the role of an adult can be seen throughout the film. Notably, when Sullivan is injured, Michael Jr. has to feed him like a baby, here adopting the role of a parent. With Michael Jr.'s loss of innocence in mind, you might expect him to shoot Maguire, continuing the cycle of violence and setting himself on the same road to perdition of his father. The fact that Michael Jr. is unable to pull the trigger and is saved from having to murder the hitman by his father's final act suggests a moment of hope amongst the film's undeniable relentless tragedy, in that the cycle of violence is finally broken. And that feeling of hope that you get is short-lived if you've ever read the sequel to the graphic novel that the film is based on, where Michael Jr. returns from World War II to confront the gangsters responsible for his father's death, and nobly decides to forgive them. No, he doesn't do that at all. He actually violently murders them. The theme of family can be seen throughout Mendes' work, with American Beauty and Revolutionary Road satirising the idea of the suburban American family unit. In 1917, Lance Corporal Thomas Blake is motivated to go on the journey to meet up again with his brother, and there is a clear sense of brotherhood that grows between himself and Schofield. Like the symbolism of the bike in Road to Perdition, 1917 is bookmarked by the visual of a tree. When the characters are introduced and set on their journey, they're sleeping underneath a tree, often used as a symbol of family and legacy. In the film's bittersweet ending, Schofield again sits underneath a tree, this time looking at pictures of his family. Although this might seem like a happy ending, like the moment of calm on the beach in Road to Perdition, the film's title reminds the audience that there is still another year left of the war for this guy to survive.
We lived through it. The Great War, 1914 to 1917.
So the sense of tragedy evident in 1917 is something that Mendes has finely crafted throughout his body of work, as he uses every trick in the filmmaker's book to elicit an emotional response from the audience. Whether or not either film is more tragic than that scene I previously mentioned in Shrek 2, you'd have to be made of gingerbread and gumdrop buttons not to shed a tear when Schofield finally meets Thomas's brother, or Michael Jr. finishes Road to Perdition by saying this: When people ask me if Michael Sullivan was a good man or if there was just no good in him at all, I always give the same answer. I just tell them, he was my father. Thanks for making it to the end of this sad video. Do let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and you can follow us on @ScreenOnPoint or @OscarWallington on Twitter, where in a desperate attempt to stay relevant, my last tweet was about Girls Aloud. Until next time then, stay fresh, cheese bags.